Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of instructional videos to help you play chess better. This is the second of a two-part video on king and one pawn against king. And if you haven't seen the first part, I highly suggest you watch part one before you watch part two. And this is part two. Now we're talking about four major cases. The first case is where the king with the pawn, we call that the offensive king, can't help the pawn, and it's going to be a race between the pawn and the king. We dealt with that in the first video. The second case was rook pawns, where the defending king could try to get into the corner of the rook pawn. We dealt with that in video number one also. The third case is where the king is not in front of the pawn. Now, not in front does not mean behind. It could also mean on the side. The opposite of in front in this case is on the side or behind. And we dealt with that also in the first video, and I'm going to review the main points of that here. We often see people get taught that when the king is not in front, the other king should go straight back in front of the pawn. That works great if the king starts exactly in front of the pawn. The problem is that there's a lot of cases like the one we're starting with here, where the defending king isn't right in front of the pawn. It's away from in front. And what we're trying to teach people is you don't need to go straight back. All you need to do until the pawn gets to the 6th rank is prevent the white king from getting in front of the pawn. So here, let's make it black to play. And basically, white's threatening to get in front of the pawn in two moves. And black could try to get the opposition once he does that. But instead, it's much easier to just not let him in front of the pawn. Well, that means black has to get to one of these two squares, d5 or e5, in two moves, which means he could draw with either king e6 or king d6 to do that. So let's say he plays king e6, white plays king e3, and now black doesn't have to go to any of these particular squares. He just has to stop white from getting in front, so it doesn't matter whether he goes to e5 or d5. There's no opposition here. Opposition doesn't really occur until the king with the pawn gets in front of the pawn, and here he can't get in front. So at some point here, white's going to have to push the pawn to make progress. He could come behind, and as I just said, black does not have to go straight back here. If you want to use the rule, always go straight back once you get your king here. That'll work, but it's not necessary, and if your king can't get to the square that's straight back, it doesn't mean you're losing. So for instance, king e5, king c3, king d5, and eventually white's going to push the pawn. And again, black can go anywhere back. He just can't come up and get his king blocked off. So king c6, perfectly good. Now he can't let the king in front. The pawn pushes. Again, any square back will do. Now when the pawn gets to the 6th, we have that second rule, which is now the king has to go straight back. Before, he could go straight back and draw. Now he has to go straight back. If he goes anywhere else, he'll lose. We showed that in the first video. But straight back, king comes up, don't let him in front. King over. If white doesn't come up with the pawn, we'll just do it all over again. Straight back. And finally, he'll push the pawn. And let's say stalemate. All right, so in today's video, we're going to start with what happens if the white king is in front of the pawn. And we'll start with directly in front of the pawn with one rank. So we'll put the white king on d4. We'll put the black king on d6. Okay, so this is the famous opposition case. It's the opposition because there's no pawns on the side of the kings or between the kings. The kings are just facing each other. And the general rule for the opposition is if you have an odd number of squares between the kings, in this case there's one, the d5 square, then whosever move it is does not have the opposition. Or you might say whoever move it's not has the opposition, whichever way you want to say it. So if it's white's move, black has the opposition. If it's black's move, then white has the opposition. And in this kind of case, you want to have the opposition. The opposition will allow you to do what you want. In white's case, white is trying to win. The opposition will allow him to make progress to win. For black, the opposition will enable him to keep the opposition and make a draw. So let's make it white's move first here. Let's say white has 4 legal moves. It should be obvious from the first video and what we just reviewed that if he goes back and doesn't get in front of the pawn, it's an instant draw. So the only two moves he could make would be to go sideways to try to make progress with king c4 or king e4. So let's say he plays king e4. Black should retain the opposition with king e6. And now if white keeps going sideways with king f4, black will play king d5 and force white to not be in front of the pawn anymore. If white plays the pawn up, then we've just seen this. We're transposing into what we already looked at. And again, the white king's not in front of the pawn, and it's going to be a draw. If white puts his king back on d4, black repeats the position. The rule in chess is if you get to the same position with the same player to move 3 times, either player can, before they move, can claim the draw. So here, if white plays king to c4, black plays king to c6. You don't have to make the same moves to get a draw. You just have to get to the same position. So now if white plays king to d4, black, if he's playing in a tournament, could write down the move king d6 on his score sheet, could stop the clock, say to white, I claim threefold repetition of position. If white doesn't understand the rule and thinks you have to make the same moves, he could say, I don't agree. You would get the tournament director. The tournament director would come over. He would see king d6. He would see the previous moves on the score sheet. And he would say, yes, you got to this position with white to move 1 time. Now you got it with white to move a 2nd time. And now with black writing down this move, you'll get it with white to move the 3rd time. So black's claim is correct. It's threefold repetition of position. And this game is a draw. So what we see is if it's white's move here, if he moves sideways, eventually he'll either have to get behind the pawn or he'll have to get threefold repetition. If he moves backward, he's immediately not in front of the pawn, and it's a draw. So this position with white to move is a draw. Okay, let's look at this position with black to move. If black moves, then white has the opposition. Let's say black plays king to e6. So the first question I ask my students is, should you retain the opposition or should you try to make progress? And the answer is, when you're defending, you want to maintain the opposition. When you're playing to win, when you're playing on offense with the pawn, you want to make progress. So here the right move is king to c5. And now black can either go back or he can try to come up. If he comes up, white can push the pawn. Notice the king is still on a rank in front of the pawn, so that's okay. And when black goes back, white will come up. Black will go back again. White could again push the pawn. Black, now white's threatening king to c7, winning. So black will play king to d8 to stop it. White will play king d6. Black has to move out of the way. White comes up, and he gets a queen in 3 more moves. All right, so let's try something a little different. Black plays king e6. White plays here. Instead of black coming up, let's say he comes back. What can white do here? Well, white has several ways of winning this position. He could simply push the pawn because it's still behind the king. And if black plays king to d7, he can play king to d5 and retake the opposition. If he plays king to e6, white will play king c6 and make progress. And again, white is going to be winning here, same as before. White wins. All right, let's try king to c6, king to e5. Let's say black plays straight back or diagonally back to d7. The easiest thing to do here is just regain the opposition 2 squares in front of the pawn. Black moves out of the way. White makes progress. Black plays king here. Black could also play black. White will now push the pawn. Black will play king e7. Now white should not play king to c7 because after king e6 threatening king e5, he'll have to repeat the position. So the right move here is to push the pawn. Notice we're keeping the pawn in a rank lower than the king. The king is in front of the pawn. Now white's threatening king c7 with 3 more moves to queen. So black has to play king d8, king d6. King moves out of the way. King comes up and wins. Once you practice this a few times against a friend or a computer, you'll get it right forever and ever. Okay, so again, black to play. If he goes straight back, white will go straight up, keep the opposition, and white is winning. All right, so now we're going to talk about something that's extremely important. There's different rules involved, and one of the great rules is if you reach a position like this, where your king is 2 ranks in front of the pawn. It doesn't have to be on the same file. It could be on the C file, the D file, the E file. It just can't be over on like the H file. If your king is gets 2 ranks in front of a pawn, then, and a non-rook pawn we're always talking non-rook pawns in today's video. If your king gets two ranks in front of a non-rook pawn, and we're also only talking about where there's 1 pawn against 0 pawns. We're not talking about positions with multiple pawns. But if you have 1 pawn and your king gets 2 ranks in front of that pawn, then it doesn't matter whose move it is. You're always winning. Always winning. Why is this true? Well, let's say it's black's turn in this position, which it is, and black moves out of the way. White can make progress and then push the pawn, and he's going to win. But let's say instead it's white's move. Well, we know if the king is 1 rank in front of the pawn, if it's black's move, then white will have the opposition. But since white has an extra tempo to move the pawn before the pawn would catch up with the king to be on the same rank, white has a free tempo to play d4, and now it's black's move, and we have that same opposition case where he has to move out of the way and you move up. I would say of all the things you're going to learn in these king and pawn videos, the one that comes up the most in practical play is if you have a king and a pawn and your king gets 2 ranks in front of a non-rook pawn, then if you play it right, you're always winning. You should remember that rule, quote that rule. A king and pawn against king, if your king is 2 ranks in front of the non-rook pawn, you're always winning because you either have the opposition or you can get the opposition. Let's show how easy this is in practice. Let's say white has a pawn on c3 and he has a pawn on, I can put the king there, it doesn't matter. And let's say white has a pawn on g3 and g4. And, well, let's put the king on c2. It doesn't matter. And you want to know, is this a win or not? Well, what white's going to do here is he's just going to go after that pawn on g4. And the poor black king has to watch the c pawn. And white's going to take the pawn on g4, and then he's going to get the king to go 2 ranks in front of that pawn, and he's just going to win. So positions like this are always wins. Let's show that here. King to d2. Doesn't matter what black does. He can play king d5. White will just go right after the pawn, king e3. If black goes after this pawn on c4, then it's obvious that white will take the pawn and get his king in front. So let's say black tries to block the king. White will push the pawn, and now black's, let's say, in a little zugzwang. Let's say he plays king this way. White will keep pushing the pawn. Black plays here. White plays c6. Black plays here. Now, white should not keep pushing the pawn. He's going to lose a tempo if he pushes the pawn. That's a common mistake. White now says, good, you got to go get the pawn. King f4, king takes, king g4, king d6, king f5, 2 ranks in front, and we already saw that this is going to be winning. Okay, so let's play a few more moves just to show you. King to e7, let's say king g6, king f8, g4, king g8, g5. Let's say black goes in the corner, hoping for a stalemate. If it was white's move, it's actually a little tricky, and we'll look at that in a minute. But it was black's move, so white will simply play king f7, king h7, g6, king back, g7, king up, queen, and mate on the next move. Okay, so this kind of position where you can use the pawn as a decoy, win this last pawn, and get 2 ranks in front of the pawn is always going to be a win. All right, let's look at the tic-tac-toe position. Tic-tac-toe is a different kind of animal. Tic-tac-toe is named after a tic-tac-toe board. Let's say you have a pawn, and it's going to queen on d8. If we go back 1 square to d7 and create a tic-tac-toe board around that pawn, then I call this the tic-tac-toe area, and I have a rule. And the rule says if you have a non-rook pawn and your king is in the tic-tac-toe area and your pawn is somewhere on a lower rank than the king, it's behind the king, then it doesn't, unless you're losing the pawn trivially, It doesn't matter whose move it is. You're always winning if your king gets into tic-tac-toe and the pawn is behind you. So let's show that position. Here's a typical tic-tac-toe position. This is very important. Tic-tac-toe. Okay. So normally if it's white's move, black has the opposition, and that's good for black. And that's true when the pawn is further back and the king is not in the tic-tac-toe area. Once the king gets in the tic-tac-toe area, the tic-tac-toe rule takes precedence over the opposition rule, and it becomes a clear exception to opposition. So here it's white's move, black has the opposition, it doesn't matter. Watch. White plays king e6, black tries to block him with king e8, white simply pushes d6, king d8, d7, black's in zugzwang, has to play king c7, king e6, e7, and wins. So here, if black has the opposition, the tic-tac-toe rule, it doesn't help him. And it doesn't matter where the white king is. The white king could be over here, and it could be white's move. The white king could be over here, and it could be black's move. The black king could be over here, and it could be white's move. The black king could be over here, and it's black's move. It doesn't matter. The pawn could be back further. It could be here. Doesn't matter. Once the king gets to these tic-tac-toe squares, and the pawn is not equal or ahead of the king, then you're always winning. This is called, I call this a tic-tac-toe win. Other people call it other names. I like to call it a tic-tac-toe win. We already looked at the hardest case. Let's look at this case. Let's say it's black to play. Black tries to block. White could push the pawn. It's still behind the king. Or he could bring the king over. Black will play here. And now white could play here. Black plays here. White plays here. And gets a queen in 3 more moves. So it really doesn't matter. As I said, the most difficult case is the case that we've already seen, which is the pawn's on the 5th rank. It's white's move. White plays here. Black plays here. White just pushes the pawn. And he wins. There's no exception to the tic-tac-toe rule. The tic-tac-toe rule is a clear exception to the opposition rule. And again, it says if you have a non-rook pawn and you create that tic-tac-toe board and your king gets into one of those 9 squares and your pawn is in a lower rank than the king, then unless you're trivially losing the pawn, you got to win. For instance, what do I mean by trivially losing the pawn? Well, let's reverse the kings. Here it's white's move. White's king is in the tic-tac-toe area. His pawn is behind the king, but it's not a win. Why? Because he's trivially losing the pawn. Black's just going to take it off. But if we have it so black's not taking it off, it's a win. Now let's talk about the tic-tac-toe rule in knight pawns. I actually got asked this by a grandmaster once who was trying to pay me for a lesson for letting him stay over my house for the World Open. And he gave me this position, and he said, how many moves can white play to make progress? And I said, oh, I know this. I teach this. And the answer is, even though white has 4 legal moves, 1, 2, whoops, take that back, 1, 2, 3, 4, it turns out 2 of them draw, 1 of them makes no progress, but it'll win if you admit your mistake, and only 1 makes progress. Well, obviously going back takes you, you're no longer in front of the pawn, and it's no longer tic-tac-toe. So king f5 and king h5 are clearly wrong. But what about c3, c6 versus h6? It turns out only one of those works. If you play king c6, black will play king to h7 exclamation point. Now white has 2 moves. He can play king f7 or he can play g6 check. If he plays g6 check, the right move for black is to go king h8. This is an immediate draw because if white plays king f7, it's stalemate. And if white pushes the pawn, black plays king g8, and white can either stalemate him or give him the pawn. So after king c6, king h7, if white plays g6, it's an immediate draw. Let's say white plays king c7 and black plays king h8. Well, now clearly if white pushes the pawn to g6, it's an immediate draw. So here what white has to do is admit his mistake and say, I guess I shouldn't have played king c6, and now play king g6, and now this position has been repeated, and now white should do the right thing. If he keeps doing the wrong thing, black will get a 3-fold repetition of position. The only way to make progress is to play king h6. Now clearly if black moves his king out to the c file, to the f file, white will play king h7. So black has to play king h8. And now white simply has the correct tic-tac-toe tempos to win. g6, king g8, g7, king f7, king h7 wins. It was funny, in one of my earlier videos where I was showing the 3-pawn against 3-pawn video, I actually got to this position and it was black to move, and I forgot if it's black to move, then white just plays king c7 and wins. And I was thinking it was white to move, and I was thinking, oh, you have to be careful here. But actually, if it's black to move, which we'll show again, white just goes here, and now when black plays king h7, g6 is check, and he's going to get his queen. It's only when it's white to move that it's tricky with the knight pawn. King h6 is the correct and only way to make progress. As I said, if someone plays here, you should know to play here. If they play here, you should know to play king h8 exclamation point. Game over, draw. It's either going to be a stalemate or a draw this way. So king here, exclamation point. If white wants to win, he has to admit his mistake and then play the right move, which is king h6, and now you can just push the pawn. Squeeze them out and you win. So there's no exception to tic-tac-toe. It always works with a non-rook pawn, tic-tac-toe. So now we've talked about two of the most important principles, rules that you need to know with the king in front. One is tic-tac-toe, and the other one we talked about, if your king gets 2 ranks in front of a non-rook pawn, and there's only a king and a pawn against a king, then you're always winning. Let's talk a little bit about distant opposition real quickly. Distant opposition usually occurs when you make a triangle between the two kings. Sorry, not a triangle, a rectangle. And the kings are on the same color in opposite corners. The way you can do that when they're on the same file is simply make the rectangle a 1 by n rectangle. Here it would be 1 by 7. And here, when white goes king to g2, he has the distant opposition, which means as black tries to come up, white can keep getting the opposition. Notice he's back to the opposition we looked at with 1 apart. So let's look at one case to see what's happening here. Let's try this position. Okay, so in order to try for distant opposition, white should play king to g2. And now black has to make a move. At some point, he's got to start moving toward the pawn. So let's say he plays king to f7. White will play king to f3. Now, black could keep coming up, but white will immediately get the opposition and win. So if black plays king to e6, white will play king e4, king d6, king d4, king c6, king c4, king b6, king b4. And now we've seen this before. King a6, king c5, making progress. King b7, king b5, king c7, king a6, king c6, b4, king c7, b5, king b8, king b6. This is the case where it's black's move, so we don't have to worry about making sure we do the right move. King a8, king c7, king a7, pawn checks, king a8, pawn checks, and we get a queen. So after king g2, king f7, king f6, king f3, black cleverly plays king e7. Now if white comes up, king e4, black will get the opposition. And when white runs over, white to play draw. We've already seen this. So white's not going to come up. He's going to keep the opposition by playing king e3. Again, black doesn't want to come up and give white the opposition, so he moves sideways. White moves sideways. Black moves sideways to c7. White moves sideways to c3. And now black does something very, very clever. Black to play and draw. He has 8 legal moves. Which one is it? King to b7. And now white's got a problem. He can't keep the opposition with king b3. The pawn's in the way. Remember what I said earlier about opposition only really works when there's no pawns on the side or in between the kings. this is a good example. White can't keep the opposition here. If he comes up, then black gets the opposition, keeps the opposition, and draws. If he comes back, then black says, oh, but now you can't get in front of the pawn. Easy draw. If white plays king d3, black just repeats the position with king c7. If white comes up, black gets the opposition. King here, draw. Let's say white tries to push the pawn. Black simply says, all right, I got my king in front of the pawn, draw. So this position is actually white to play, but black to cleverly draw. White can try to keep the distant opposition, but by realizing that the pawn's going to get in the way, it's actually white to play and black to draw. Clever draw here. Remember, if black ever comes up, he's going to lose. King to b7, and the game is a draw. So here, having the distant opposition doesn't work because we're going to run into the pawn. If we weren't running into the pawn, if we put the pawn somewhere where we're not going to run into it and keep the distant opposition, then white would win. All right, I don't want to get too much into all the possible distant oppositions, but I thought I'd show you this cute one, which I've always liked, which shows you both the offensive and defensive ideas in trying to keep the distant opposition. Again, the distant opposition, how do we know? If they're on the same file, if you move your king to a square the same color, then there's an odd number in between, and it's his move, and that's what you want. You want an odd number of squares in between with the opponent's king moving. And that's what we saw when we started, when we had the kings here. Odd number of squares in between on the same file. White to play, black has the opposition. He continues to keep the opposition with king c6. He gets a draw. With black to play, he has to give ground. And now white does not want to keep the opposition. He wants to make progress, and he will win. Try to remember the two rules that I taught you, which are if the king is 2 squares in front of a non-rook pawn, then it's always going to be a win, and the tic-tac-toe rule. If you remember those two rules, it really helps. And of course, remember, how do you draw with black if you have the opposition here, if it's white's move? Remember, just keep getting the opposition here until you get threefold repetition or force the king behind the pawn. Okay, we've covered 98% of king and one pawn against king. And now if you just throw a king and a pawn and a king on the board, you should be able to make 2 evaluations. You should be able to say, white to play, this is a win, black to play, this is a draw, or white to play, this is a draw, black to play, white wins, or white to play, it's a draw, black to play, it's a draw. Whatever it is, you should be able to evaluate the position. That's the goal of these 2 videos, is between the 2 videos, you should be able to know if you trade down into king and pawn against king, you should know whether it's a win or not. And of course, white does not want to trade into king and pawn against king if it's a draw. If he has the pawn, we're assuming, of course. Black only wants to trade into king and pawn against king if he knows he can get a draw. You would never trade into king and pawn against king if you're not getting what you want. If you're the one with a pawn, you don't trade into it if it's a draw. And if you're the one who has no pawns, if you're the lone king, you would not trade into a king and pawn against king unless you know you can get a draw. Otherwise, you keep the other pieces on the board if at all possible. Okay, and everything starts with this. Once you know what to do with king and pawn against king, then you can start thinking about king and 2 pawns against king and 1 pawn, or king and rook and pawn against king and rook, that kind of thing, because you know when to trade and when not to trade. That's the idea of these 2 videos. If you don't get it, go back, look at the videos again, practice with the computer, practice with a friend. Just keep doing it over and over again until it becomes second nature, and you'll be able to do it right each time. I see so many people play these things wrong. Don't be one of them. Okay, for my YouTube series, this is Dan Heisman. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next time. Thanks. Bye.